The slap echoed through the medical office like a gunshot. Victoria Hayes never saw it coming. 20 weeks pregnant, standing in what should have been the happiest moment of her life, finding out she was having a daughter. She suddenly found herself staring at her millionaire husband in complete shock, her cheek burning from his violent blow. But here's what Richard Hayes didn't know. The lab technician who heard everything from the hallway wasn't just any hospital worker. He was Victoria's brother Marcus, a Navy hospital corpsman trained in combat medicine and sworn to protect the innocent. What happened next would expose a web of psychological manipulation, secret drugging, and systematic abuse so shocking that it would destroy a multi-million-dollar empire and change domestic violence prosecution forever. This is the true story of how one moment of violence in a hospital corridor became a battle between wealth and justice, between family loyalty and military duty, between a woman's fight for freedom and a millionaire's desperate attempt to maintain control. You're about to hear how a routine ultrasound appointment became the catalyst for one of the most dramatic domestic violence cases in recent history, and why the outcome would save not just Victoria and her unborn daughter, but dozens of other women trapped in similar nightmares. The slap echoed through the medical office like a gunshot. Victoria Hayes pressed her trembling fingers against her burning cheek, staring at her millionaire husband in complete shock. 20 weeks pregnant with their first child, she had never imagined this moment would come during what should have been the happiest day of their marriage. "Richard, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the humming of medical equipment. "The baby." "Don't you dare blame this on the baby," Richard Hayes snarled, his expensive suit wrinkled from pacing the small examination room for the past hour. "You embarrassed me in front of that incompetent doctor with your pathetic whimpering." Dr. Sarah Mitchell had stepped out moments before the explosion, called away to handle an emergency delivery. The ultrasound screen still displayed the frozen image of their daughter, the gender reveal that had triggered Richard's rage about having another weak female to deal with. Victoria's hands instinctively moved to protect her rounded belly. 6 years of marriage had taught her to recognize the warning signs of Richard's volcanic temper, but pregnancy had made his controlling behavior exponentially worse. Every doctor's appointment became a battlefield where her choices were questioned, her medical decisions overruled, and her very existence criticized. "I was just asking about natural childbirth classes," Victoria said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Carmen's sister said they really helped her feel more prepared." "Carmen," Richard spat the name like poison. "That nobody school counselor filling your head with organic nonsense and feminist garbage. I've told you to stop associating with people beneath our social status." The irony wasn't lost on Victoria. Before marrying Richard, she had been a dedicated elementary school teacher, passionate about helping children learn and grow. Now, according to her husband, her former profession made her common and unsuitable for proper society functions. Richard resumed his aggressive pacing, designer shoes clicking against the clinic's polished floor. His real estate development company had made him wealthy beyond most people's dreams. But money had also made him believe he could control every aspect of life, including his wife's medical care. "This clinic is beneath our standards," Richard declared, gesturing dismissively at the cheerful pediatric artwork covering the walls. "Mother was right. We should be seeing Dr. Pemberton at the private hospital. This place looks like a community health center." Victoria bit back her response. She had specifically chosen Dr. Mitchell because of her excellent reputation and genuine warmth toward patients. The clinic might not have marble floors and crystal chandeliers like the facility Eleanor Hayes preferred, but the medical care was exceptional and the staff treated everyone with dignity. "Dr. Mitchell delivered Carmen's nephew safely when he was born premature," Victoria explained carefully. "Her success rate with high-risk pregnancies is outstanding." "High risk?" Richard whirled around, his face flushing red. "Are you telling me there's something wrong with my child? Have you been hiding medical problems from me?" "No, Richard. I just meant that any pregnancy can have complications. And Dr. Mitchell has experience handling whatever might arise." "Stop making excuses for your poor choices," Richard snapped, pulling out his phone to check messages. "Mother has already scheduled appointments with 3 different specialists, real doctors who understand what's at stake here." The phrase "what's at stake" sent chills down Victoria's spine. Lately, Richard and his mother Eleanor had been having increasingly frequent private conversations about the pregnancy, often ending abruptly when Victoria entered the room. Their whispered discussions always seemed to center around protecting family interests and ensuring proper arrangements. Through the thin examination room walls, Victoria could hear the familiar sounds of a busy medical clinic, phones ringing, quiet conversations between staff members, and the soft beeping of monitoring equipment. Somewhere in this building, her younger brother Marcus was working his part-time civilian job as a lab technician while maintaining his active duty status as a Navy hospital corpsman. Marcus had taken the lab position to supplement his military income and gain additional medical experience. He often joked that analyzing blood samples was easier than treating combat injuries, but Victoria knew he took every aspect of medical care seriously. His dedication to helping people heal had been evident since childhood, when he would carefully bandage her scraped knees and promise to always protect her. "I see Marcus Wellington is working today," Victoria mentioned casually, having spotted his name on the staff schedule board in the waiting room. "I thought I might say hello after the appointment." Richard's expression darkened further. "That military, nobody, Victoria. We've discussed this. Your association with people from your previous life reflects poorly on our family's reputation. Mother specifically mentioned that your brother's presence at social events makes people uncomfortable." "Marcus serves our country," Victoria replied, finding a spark of her old defiance. "He saved lives in combat zones and continues serving at the Naval Medical Center. He's not someone to be ashamed of." "He's a reminder of where you came from," Richard said coldly. "Low-income family, public school education, state university degree. I elevated you from that mediocrity, and you seem determined to drag us back down to your level." The words stung because they carried a grain of truth Victoria had learned to accept. She and Marcus had grown up in a modest home, with parents who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. Their father drove delivery trucks while their mother cleaned office buildings at night. College scholarships had made higher education possible, but luxury had never been part of their vocabulary. Richard had pursued Victoria during her first year teaching, charming her with expensive dinners and elaborate gifts. His attention had felt like winning the lottery. She had been swept away by his confidence, his success, and his promise of a life filled with security and comfort. What she hadn't anticipated was how completely that security would depend on his approval. "Dr. Mitchell will be back soon," Victoria said, hoping to redirect the conversation toward safer topics. "The ultrasound showed everything developing normally. Our daughter is healthy and active." "Our daughter," Richard repeated bitterly. "Do you have any idea what this means for the family legacy? The Hayes name has been carried by strong men for 4 generations. Now I'll be stuck with some weak little princess who'll probably end up just like you, needing constant supervision and protection." Victoria felt tears threatening, but forced them back. Showing emotion would only escalate Richard's anger and potentially endanger the baby. She had learned to endure his verbal attacks by focusing on protecting the life growing inside her. A soft knock interrupted Richard's tirade. "Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Mitchell asked me to check if you need anything while she finishes with the emergency delivery," called a familiar voice through the door. Victoria's heart jumped with recognition. "Marcus." "Victoria." The door opened to reveal her younger brother in his civilian lab coat, looking surprised and delighted. "I saw your name on the schedule but wasn't sure you'd want company during the appointment." Marcus Wellington stood 29 years old and radiating the quiet confidence that came from military training and medical expertise. His warm smile and protective presence had been Victoria's anchor during childhood, and seeing him now felt like a lifeline in turbulent waters. "Marcus, this is my husband Richard," Victoria said quickly, hoping to prevent conflict. "Richard, this is my brother Marcus, the Navy corpsman I've told you about." Richard's expression shifted to cold assessment as he evaluated Marcus with obvious disdain. "The lab technician," he said dismissively. "I suppose military medical training qualifies you to work with actual healthcare professionals." "I'm honored to serve in whatever capacity helps people heal," Marcus replied evenly, though Victoria caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "Victoria, congratulations on the pregnancy. How are you feeling?" "She's fine," Richard answered before Victoria could speak. "Everything is proceeding normally. We don't need any additional medical opinions from unqualified personnel." Marcus's eyes flicked briefly to Victoria's face, and she saw him notice her still red cheek and defensive posture. His medical training included recognizing signs of domestic violence, and Victoria prayed he wouldn't voice any suspicions. "Of course," Marcus said diplomatically. "I'll let Dr. Mitchell know you're waiting. Victoria, it's wonderful seeing you. Maybe we can catch up soon." "That won't be necessary," Richard interjected sharply. "Victoria's social calendar is quite full with appropriate commitments. She doesn't have time for casual family visits." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Marcus processed Richard's dismissal. Victoria watched her brother's expression shift subtly from friendly concern to careful evaluation. Years of military service had taught him to assess threats quickly and respond appropriately. "I understand," Marcus said quietly, his tone carrying undertones that Victoria recognized as controlled anger. "Victoria, you know how to reach me if you ever need anything. Anything at all." After Marcus left, Richard turned his full fury toward Victoria. "How dare you embarrass me in front of that nobody acting like your close family friends when you know Mother has specifically requested you maintain appropriate social boundaries?" "Marcus is my brother," Victoria protested weakly. "We grew up together. He's always been there when I needed support." "Well, you don't need his support anymore," Richard declared. "You have me and my family's resources. Your brother's interference in our lives ends now. I'll be speaking with the clinic administration about his unprofessional behavior." Victoria's blood ran cold. "Richard, please don't get Marcus in trouble at work. He was just being friendly. He didn't do anything wrong." "He overstepped boundaries by inserting himself into our private medical appointment," Richard said coldly. "Military personnel should understand chain of command and proper protocols. Apparently, your brother needs a reminder about respecting his superiors." The threat hung heavy in the air as Dr. Mitchell returned, apologizing for the delay and resuming the ultrasound examination. Victoria tried to focus on the grainy images of her daughter moving peacefully in the womb, but Richard's ominous words echoed in her mind. She had spent 6 years learning to navigate Richard's controlling behavior, finding ways to maintain some semblance of independence while avoiding his explosive anger. But now, with pregnancy hormones affecting her emotional stability and Marcus potentially in Richard's crosshairs, Victoria realized her carefully constructed survival strategies might not be sufficient anymore. The appointment concluded with Dr. Mitchell's reassurances about the baby's healthy development and scheduled follow-up visits. As they prepared to leave, Victoria caught a glimpse of Marcus through the hallway window, concentrating intently on lab work. His presence in the building felt both comforting and dangerous. Walking to the parking garage, Richard resumed his criticism of Victoria's behavior and her inappropriate emotional attachment to her family of origin. Each word felt like another weight added to the invisible chains she carried, making it harder to remember the confident teacher she had once been. But for the first time in months, Victoria also felt something else stirring beneath her fear, a tiny spark of rebellion. Fanned by seeing Marcus and remembering that she had once been someone worthy of unconditional love and protection, that spark would prove more dangerous to Richard's control than he could possibly imagine. Dr. Sarah Mitchell resumed the ultrasound with practiced efficiency, her experienced hands maneuvering the probe across Victoria's gel-covered belly. The 20-week scan was proceeding normally, showing clear images of a healthy developing baby. But the tension in the examination room remained thick enough to cut. "Everything looks perfect," Dr. Mitchell announced warmly, pointing to various features on the monitor. "Strong heartbeat, good growth measurements, and all the major organs are developing beautifully. Would you like to know the baby's gender?" Victoria nodded eagerly, momentarily forgetting Richard's earlier outburst in her excitement about finally learning whether they were having a son or daughter. She had been dreaming about this moment for weeks, imagining how they would decorate the nursery and choose the perfect name. "Congratulations," Dr. Mitchell smiled broadly. "You're having a daughter." "A daughter," Victoria whispered, tears of joy filling her eyes as she watched their baby girl moving gracefully on the ultrasound screen. "Richard, we're having a little girl." The silence that followed felt ominous. Victoria turned to see Richard's face contorting with unmistakable disgust and rage, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The reaction was so extreme and unexpected that Dr. Mitchell paused mid-sentence, clearly sensing the dramatic shift in atmosphere. "A girl," Richard said flatly, his voice dripping with disappointment. "Of course it's a girl. Another weak, pathetic female to drain resources and contribute nothing meaningful to society. Dr. Mitchell's eyebrows rose in shock. Mr. Hayes, daughters are equally precious gifts. Girls today accomplish incredible things in every field imaginable. Spare me the feminist lecture, Richard snapped, beginning to pace the small room like a caged predator. I needed a son to carry on the Hayes family legacy. Instead, I get saddled with some useless princess who'll spend her life shopping and gossiping. Victoria felt her heart breaking as she watched Richard dismiss their unborn daughter with casual cruelty. Richard, please don't talk about our baby that way. She's perfect and healthy. That's what matters. Perfect. Richard whirled around, his face flushed with anger. There's nothing perfect about ruining 4 generations of Hayes men with your defective genetics. My mother warned me this might happen when I married beneath my social class. The insult hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had endured months of Richard's increasingly controlling behavior. But hearing him blame her genetics for their daughter's gender crossed a line she hadn't known existed. You're being completely irrational, Victoria said, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. The father's chromosomes determine the baby's gender, not the mother's. Basic biology proves that. Don't you dare lecture me about science, Richard snarled, his voice rising dangerously. You're a failed elementary school teacher married to a millionaire real estate developer. Know your place. Dr. Mitchell cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps we could focus on the positive aspects of your daughter's health and development. The ultrasound shows excellent progress, and there are no indicators of any complications. Complications, Richard repeated bitterly. The biggest complication is having a daughter instead of a son. Do you have any idea what this means for my business partnerships? My associates expect successful men to produce strong male heirs. Victoria stared at her husband in growing horror, realizing that his disappointment ran far deeper than simple gender preference. In Richard's worldview, their daughter represented a fundamental failure that reflected poorly on his masculine image and social standing. Maybe you should step outside for some fresh air, Dr. Mitchell suggested tactfully. These appointments can be overwhelming, and it's important to process the information calmly. I'm perfectly calm, Richard declared, though his pacing had become more aggressive and his face remained flushed with anger. I'm simply dealing with the reality of my wife's inability to provide what our family needs. Mr. Hayes, Dr. Mitchell said firmly, I need you to understand that genetic gender determination is entirely random. Neither parent controls whether they have sons or daughters. Your wife has done nothing wrong. Haven't you been listening? Richard's voice rose to near shouting level. Everything about this situation is wrong. The clinic, the medical care, the results, and especially my wife's complete failure to understand what's expected of her. Victoria instinctively moved her hands to protect her belly as Richard's anger escalated beyond anything she had witnessed before. His verbal abuse had been building throughout the pregnancy, but this explosion felt different, more dangerous and unrestrained. Richard, you're scaring me, Victoria whispered. Please calm down for the baby's sake. For the baby's sake, Richard laughed harshly. The baby who's already disappointed me before she's even born, the daughter who'll spend 18 years costing me money with nothing to show for it except wedding expenses and divorce settlements when she inevitably fails at marriage like most women do. Dr. Mitchell stood up abruptly, clearly recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond normal disappointment into dangerous territory. Mr. Hayes, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice and show respect for your wife and unborn child. Respect? Richard turned his fury toward the doctor. You want me to show respect in this second-rate clinic with its mediocre staff and unprofessional procedures? My mother was absolutely right about seeking proper medical care from qualified physicians. Victoria felt humiliated as Richard's insults extended to Dr. Mitchell, who had provided nothing but excellent, compassionate care throughout her pregnancy. The doctor's professionalism and genuine concern had made Victoria feel safe and supported, which was more than she could say about her own husband's treatment. I think it would be best if you stepped outside while I finish the examination, Dr. Mitchell said calmly but firmly. These conversations are causing unnecessary stress during what should be a positive experience. I'm not going anywhere, Richard declared. This is my child and my appointment. I'll express my opinions however I choose. As if summoned by the escalating voices, the examination room door opened slightly and Marcus appeared, wearing his lab coat and carrying a clipboard. His trained medical eye immediately assessed the scene, taking in Victoria's defensive posture, Dr. Mitchell's concerned expression, and Richard's aggressive stance. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely. "Dr. Mitchell, is everything all right here?" We could hear raised voices from the hallway. "Everything is fine," Richard snapped before anyone else could respond. "This is a private family matter that doesn't concern clinic staff." Marcus's gaze moved to Victoria, and she saw him notice her distressed expression and protective hand positioning over her belly. His military training had taught him to read body language and recognize situations where civilians might be in danger. "Victoria, how are you feeling?" Marcus asked gently, his tone carefully professional but carrying undertones of brotherly concern. "She's fine," Richard answered again, stepping between Victoria and Marcus. "We don't need input from unqualified personnel who should be focusing on their assigned laboratory duties. I have medical training that includes recognizing when patients might need additional support," Marcus replied evenly, though Victoria caught the slight edge in his voice. "Mrs. Hayes, are you comfortable continuing the appointment under these circumstances?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria realized that Marcus was offering her an opportunity to acknowledge her distress and potentially receive help. But accepting his offer would mean defying Richard in front of witnesses and facing unknown consequences later. "Answer him," Richard commanded coldly. "Tell this nobody that you're perfectly fine and don't need his interference." Victoria looked between her husband and her brother, feeling trapped between competing loyalties and terrified of making the wrong choice. Richard's anger had reached levels she had never witnessed, but challenging him directly could make everything worse. "I'm okay," Victoria said quietly, though her trembling voice suggested otherwise. "Thank you for checking." Marcus. Marcus studied her face intently, clearly not convinced by her response, but professionally obligated to respect her stated wishes. His military experience included recognizing when people were being coerced, but couldn't openly ask for help. "Of course," Marcus said diplomatically. "Dr. Mitchell, please let me know if you need anything else." As Marcus turned to leave, Richard's anger found a new target. "Wait," he called sharply. "I want to speak with your supervisor about your unprofessional behavior and inappropriate involvement in confidential patient matters." Marcus stopped in the doorway, his shoulders tensing slightly as he processed Richard's threat. "Sir, I was responding to reports of raised voices that could indicate a medical emergency. Standard protocol requires checking on patient welfare." "Standard protocol." Richard's voice dripped with disdain. "Let me tell you about protocol. I'm Richard Hayes of Hayes Development Corporation. My company has contracts worth millions of dollars with various military installations. One phone call from me could end your civilian career and negatively impact your military service record." The threat was delivered with cold precision, designed to intimidate Marcus into submission and demonstrate Richard's power over people he considered inferior. Victoria watched in horror as her husband weaponized his wealth and connections against her brother. "I understand," Marcus replied quietly, though his military bearing remained strong and dignified. "I apologize if my concern for patient welfare was misinterpreted as interference." "See that it doesn't happen again," Richard declared triumphantly. "Military personnel should understand chain of command and proper respect for their superiors." After Marcus left, the examination room felt poisoned by Richard's threats and intimidation tactics. Dr. Mitchell completed the ultrasound in uncomfortable silence, clearly disturbed by what she had witnessed but professionally obligated to maintain neutrality. "Everything looks wonderful with your daughter's development," Dr. Mitchell said to Victoria, deliberately emphasizing the positive aspects of the appointment. "I'll have the ultrasound photos printed for you to take home." "Photos?" Richard interjected. "We don't need amateur pictures of medical procedures. My mother has already arranged professional documentation through proper channels." Victoria felt another piece of her independence being stripped away as Richard dismissed even the simple joy of ultrasound photos. These small moments of connection with her unborn daughter were being systematically eliminated by his need to control every aspect of her pregnancy experience. As they prepared to leave, Victoria caught one last glimpse of Marcus through the hallway window. He was standing very still, staring at something on his phone screen with an expression she recognized from childhood. The look he got when he was planning how to protect her from bullies or dangerous situations. Walking to their car, Richard continued his verbal assault on Victoria's choices, her family background, and her failure to produce the son he demanded. But for the first time since the ultrasound began, Victoria wasn't entirely focused on his words. Instead, she was remembering the look in Marcus's eyes when he heard Richard's threats. Her brother had spent years training to protect people in dangerous situations, and Victoria had a growing suspicion that he wasn't going to let Richard's intimidation tactics go unchallenged. That realization should have terrified her, but instead, it planted a tiny seed of hope in her heart. The slap landed across Victoria's cheek with stunning force, the sound echoing through the medical examination room like a gunshot. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her burning face as shock and pain registered simultaneously. 20 weeks pregnant and vulnerable. She had never imagined Richard would escalate to physical violence, especially in such a public setting. Marcus Wellington froze in the doorway, his clipboard clattering to the floor as he processed what he had just witnessed. His sister, the person he had sworn to protect since childhood, had been struck by her millionaire husband during a routine medical appointment. Every instinct honed by military training and brotherly devotion screamed for immediate action. "Victoria," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled calm that preceded decisive military action. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him while mentally cataloging evidence and assessing the threat level. "This is a private family matter," Richard declared, seemingly unaware that assaulting his pregnant wife in front of a Navy hospital corpsman constituted a serious escalation. "I suggest you leave immediately before I have you reported for unprofessional conduct." Marcus ignored Richard completely, focusing his attention on Victoria while his medical training kicked into automatic assessment mode. Red mark across the left cheek, defensive posturing with hands protecting abdomen, elevated breathing consistent with shock and fear. His sister needed immediate medical evaluation and emotional support. "Ma'am, I need to examine your face and check for any injuries," Marcus said professionally, though Victoria could hear the barely controlled anger beneath his clinical tone. That impact could have caused soft tissue damage or other complications. "She's fine," Richard snapped, positioning himself between Marcus and Victoria. "My wife doesn't need medical attention from unqualified military personnel. We'll seek appropriate care from real doctors." Marcus's jaw tightened as he processed Richard's dismissive attitude toward both his medical credentials and his sister's welfare. Years of combat medicine had taught him to recognize when civilians were in immediate danger, and every indicator suggested Victoria needed protection from her own husband. "Sir, I'm a Navy hospital corpsman with advanced trauma training," Marcus replied evenly. "Assessing potential head injuries falls well within my medical scope of practice. Please step aside so I can evaluate the patient properly." "The patient is my wife," Richard declared possessively. "I decide what medical care she receives and from whom. Your services are neither requested nor required." Victoria remained silent, touching her swollen cheek while watching the confrontation unfold between her husband and her brother. The physical pain was manageable, but the emotional devastation of Richard's violence was overwhelming. 6 years of psychological conditioning had taught her to minimize his abuse and avoid escalating conflicts. "Victoria," Marcus said gently, using her name to establish personal connection beyond the clinical setting, "I need you to tell me if you're experiencing any dizziness, nausea, or vision changes. Head trauma can have delayed symptoms that affect both you and the baby." The mention of potential harm to her unborn daughter broke through Victoria's shocked paralysis. "I feel okay," she said softly. "Just the stinging from where it happened." Marcus nodded, pulling out his phone with movements so subtle that Richard didn't immediately notice. His military training included evidence documentation for incident reports, and domestic violence against a pregnant woman constituted a serious federal offense under military jurisdiction. "I'm going to take some photos of the injury for medical documentation," Marcus announced calmly. "Standard protocol for any trauma assessment." "You will not take pictures of my wife without permission," Richard declared, lunging forward to grab Marcus's phone. "This is harassment and possibly illegal surveillance." Marcus sidestepped Richard's advance with fluid military precision, protecting his phone while positioning himself between the aggressive husband and his pregnant sister. Years of combat training had prepared him for exactly this type of volatile confrontation. "Sir, you need to step back immediately," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of military rank. "Interfering with medical personnel performing their duties is a federal offense, especially when the patient is pregnant." "Medical personnel," Richard laughed harshly. "You're a lab technician playing dress-up in a military costume? I told you already. One phone call from me can destroy your pathetic career and have you court-martialed for insubordination." Marcus felt his carefully controlled professional demeanor begin to crack as Richard's threats became more specific and personal. This wasn't some random civilian causing problems. This was the man who had just physically assaulted his sister and was now threatening to destroy his military career for providing medical assistance. "Mr. Hayes," Marcus said slowly, his training in de-escalation techniques warring with his protective instincts, "I strongly recommend you contact your attorney before making any more statements. Domestic violence is a serious criminal matter with significant legal consequences." "Domestic violence?" Richard's face flushed with indignation. "That's a ridiculous accusation. My wife became hysterical during a stressful medical appointment, and I provided appropriate correction. Any reasonable person would understand the situation." Victoria winced at Richard's casual dismissal of his assault as appropriate correction, a phrase that revealed how completely he had normalized his abusive behavior. The psychological manipulation was almost as damaging as the physical violence. Dr. Sarah Mitchell chose that moment to return from her emergency. Immediately sensing the tension in the room and noticing Victoria's reddening, swollen cheek, her medical training and legal obligations kicked into gear as she processed the obvious signs of domestic violence. "What happened here?" Dr. Mitchell demanded, moving quickly to examine Victoria's face while shooting accusatory looks at Richard. "Mrs. Hayes, how did you sustain this injury?" "She fell," Richard said quickly, before Victoria could respond. "Pregnant women can be clumsy and unsteady." She stumbled against the examination table edge. "Sure. Marcus felt his military training in recognizing false statements activate as he observed Richard's body language and heard his obviously rehearsed explanation. The timeline, the injury pattern, and the defensive positioning all contradicted the claimed accidental fall. "That's not consistent with the injury pattern," Marcus said professionally. "The mark shows clear finger and palm definition across the cheek, which is characteristic of an open-hand strike rather than blunt trauma from furniture contact." Dr. Mitchell nodded grimly, her own medical expertise confirming Marcus's assessment. "Mrs. Hayes, I need you to tell me exactly how this injury occurred. Your safety and your baby's welfare are my primary concerns." Victoria looked between her husband's threatening expression and her brother's supportive presence, feeling torn between survival instincts that demanded she protect herself by lying and growing awareness that the situation had escalated beyond her ability to control through compliance. "He hit me," Victoria whispered, the words barely audible but carrying devastating impact in the small room. "Richard slapped me when he got angry about the baby being a girl." The confession hung in the air like an explosive device, changing everything and making it impossible for anyone to pretend the assault hadn't occurred. Richard's face went white as he realized his wife had just provided witness testimony that could result in criminal charges. "She's obviously confused from the fall," Richard said desperately. "Pregnancy hormones and stress can cause false memories and paranoid thinking. My wife needs psychiatric evaluation, not criminal investigation." Marcus stepped closer to Victoria, his protective presence making her feel safer than she had in months. "Victoria, I need to document your injuries and take your statement for an official report. You have the right to medical care and legal protection." "Official report," Richard's voice rose dangerously. "You have no authority to file reports about private family matters. I warned you about interfering with things beyond your understanding." "Actually," Marcus said calmly, pulling out his military identification, "I have both medical authority as a Navy hospital corpsman and legal obligation under federal domestic violence statutes to report incidents involving pregnant women." Dr. Mitchell moved to the examination room phone, her intentions clear. "I'm calling hospital security and notifying the appropriate authorities. This situation requires immediate intervention to ensure patient safety." Don't you dare, Richard commanded, his millionaire's sense of entitlement clashing with the reality that wealth couldn't prevent the legal consequences of domestic violence. I'll have all of you fired and sued for false accusations and professional misconduct. Marcus looked directly at Richard, his military bearing radiating quiet strength and unwavering determination. Sir, my oath as a hospital corpsman requires me to protect patients from harm, regardless of who might be causing that harm. Your threats won't change my duty or my commitment to my sister's safety. The word sister seemed to hit Richard like another slap, as he realized that the lab technician he had been dismissing and threatening was actually Victoria's brother, the Navy corpsman she had mentioned with obvious affection and respect. Your sister, Richard repeated slowly, pieces of the confrontation suddenly making more sense. The military, nobody she talks about occasionally. I should have realized she would have filled your head with lies and manipulative stories. The only lies I'm hearing are your attempts to explain away assault and battery, Marcus replied firmly. Victoria's injuries speak for themselves, and there are multiple witnesses to your violent behavior. As hospital security arrived and Dr. Mitchell began her official documentation, Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the invisible chains that had bound her to Richard's control for years. Seeing Marcus stand up to her husband's threats and intimidation reminded her of who she had been before marriage transformed her into a fearful shadow of herself. For the first time in months, Victoria began to believe that escape from Richard's abuse might actually be possible. Her brother's military training and unwavering loyalty had created a crack in the wall of isolation and control that Richard had built around her. That crack would soon become a breach that no amount of wealth or threats could repair. Hospital security arrived within minutes. Two uniformed officers responding to Dr. Mitchell's urgent call about a domestic violence incident in progress. The small examination room suddenly felt crowded as professional protocols kicked into gear, and Richard's carefully constructed world of privilege began colliding with legal reality. Officers, thank you for coming so quickly, Dr. Mitchell said, maintaining her professional composure while clearly shaken by the events. We have a pregnant patient who sustained facial injuries during what appears to be a domestic violence incident. Richard immediately stepped forward, his millionaire's confidence intact despite the deteriorating situation. Officers, there's been a serious misunderstanding. My wife fell during a stressful medical appointment, and this lab technician has been harassing us with false accusations and inappropriate medical claims. Marcus held up his military identification and medical credentials, his bearing radiating the quiet authority that came from years of service and extensive trauma training. I'm Navy Hospital Corpsman Wellington, currently serving active duty while working part-time in this civilian capacity. I witnessed the assault and have documented the injuries consistent with domestic violence. The security officers exchanged glances, recognizing that this situation involved more than typical hospital drama. Military personnel carried federal authority in certain circumstances, and domestic violence cases required careful handling to ensure victim safety and legal compliance. Ma'am, the senior officer addressed Victoria directly. We need to hear your account of what happened here today. Take your time and tell us exactly what occurred. Victoria felt the weight of everyone's attention focused on her, the moment of truth that would determine whether she continued enabling Richard's abuse or finally acknowledged the reality of her situation. Her brother's supportive presence gave her courage, but Richard's threatening glare reminded her of potential consequences. I was having my 20-week ultrasound, Victoria began quietly, her voice gaining strength as she continued. We learned we're having a daughter, and Richard became extremely angry. He said terrible things about having a girl instead of a boy, and when I tried to calm him down, he slapped me across the face. Richard's face flushed with indignation as his carefully crafted narrative crumbled under Victoria's truthful testimony. Officers, my wife is obviously confused and emotional from pregnancy hormones. This minor incident has been blown completely out of proportion by military personnel who have no business interfering with family matters. Mr. Hayes, the senior officer said firmly, domestic violence is a serious criminal matter regardless of the circumstances. We need to complete our investigation and ensure everyone's safety before making any determinations about appropriate actions. Marcus stepped forward with his phone, displaying the photos he had taken of Victoria's injuries. I have medical documentation showing injury patterns consistent with an open-hand strike. As a trained hospital corpsman, I can testify to the cause and severity of the trauma. You have no authority to conduct medical examinations or take photographs without consent, Richard declared, his threats becoming more desperate as his control over the situation evaporated. I demand that evidence be destroyed immediately. Dr. Mitchell intervened with her own professional authority. Mr. Hayes, medical personnel are required by law to document suspected domestic violence cases. Your wife's injuries and the circumstances surrounding them create mandatory reporting obligations that supersede personal preferences. The legal net was tightening around Richard despite his wealth and connections, forcing him to confront the reality that money couldn't always prevent consequences for criminal behavior. His lifetime of privilege hadn't prepared him for situations where his authority was questioned by people with genuine legal power. This is harassment and discrimination, Richard declared, pulling out his expensive phone. I'm calling my attorney immediately. You'll all be facing lawsuits for false accusations, professional misconduct, and violation of our civil rights. Marcus watched Richard make his phone call, mentally preparing for the legal and professional battles that would inevitably follow. Military personnel face serious consequences for involvement in civilian criminal matters. But his oath to protect patients and his duty as Victoria's brother superseded personal career concerns. Victoria listened to Richard's angry phone conversation with his lawyer, catching fragments about military interference, false accusations, and substantial financial settlements. The threats that had once terrified her now seemed desperate and hollow compared to the protective presence of her brother and the professional support of Dr. Mitchell. Mrs. Hayes, the junior security officer said gently, we need to ask if you feel safe returning home with your husband today. There are resources available if you need alternative arrangements for your protection. The question hung in the air like a lifeline, offering Victoria the opportunity to escape Richard's control if she had the courage to accept help. Years of psychological conditioning made the decision terrifying, but Marcus's unwavering support gave her strength she hadn't felt in months. I don't know, Victoria admitted honestly. Richard has never hit me before, but his anger has been getting worse throughout my pregnancy. I'm scared about what might happen when we're alone. Richard ended his phone call and immediately focused his attention on damage control. Victoria, you're obviously overwrought from the medical appointment and these people's inappropriate questions. Let's go home so you can rest and recover from this stressful experience. Sir, your wife just expressed concerns about her safety, the senior officer stated firmly. We can't allow her to leave with you until we've completed our investigation and ensured her protection. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward the security officers for taking Victoria's safety seriously and following proper domestic violence protocols. Too often, wealthy abusers escaped consequences because their victims were pressured to minimize incidents or withdraw complaints. Investigation. Richard laughed harshly. What investigation? A pregnant woman became emotional during a medical appointment, stumbled, and hit her face. Now everyone is treating it like some major criminal incident because a military lab technician decided to play hero. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward with her medical expertise and legal authority. Mr. Hayes, I've examined your wife's injuries personally. The trauma pattern is completely inconsistent with accidental contact from falling. These are defensive injuries sustained from deliberate assault. The medical testimony carried significant weight in legal proceedings, especially from a respected physician with extensive experience treating trauma patients. Richard's fabricated story about accidental falls couldn't withstand professional scrutiny from qualified medical experts. Victoria watched her husband's confident facade beginning to crack under the pressure of official investigation and professional testimony. For years, Richard's wealth and social connections had protected him from accountability, but domestic violence against a pregnant woman crossed legal lines that money couldn't erase. I want to speak with my commanding officer, Marcus announced, pulling out his phone. Lieutenant Commander Burke needs to be informed about this incident immediately. Military personnel have specific protocols for handling domestic violence situations involving family members. Richard's eyes widened as he realized the implications of military involvement in the case. Defense contractors like his company maintain lucrative relationships with various military installations, and criminal charges against him could jeopardize those valuable business partnerships. Wait, Richard said quickly, his tone shifting from angry demands to desperate negotiation. Let's not involve unnecessary parties in what amounts to a private misunderstanding. I'm sure we can resolve this matter quietly among ourselves. The security officers exchanged knowing looks, recognizing Richard's sudden change in attitude as typical behavior from wealthy individuals who finally understood that their actions had real consequences. Domestic violence cases required thorough investigation regardless of the perpetrator's financial status. Marcus completed his call to Lieutenant Commander Burke, reporting the incident and requesting guidance on proper protocols for military personnel involved in civilian domestic violence cases. His commanding officer's response was swift and unambiguous. Protect the victim and cooperate fully with civilian authorities. Sir, my commanding officer is en route to provide oversight and ensure proper military protocols are followed, Marcus informed the security officers. Lieutenant Commander Burke has extensive experience with domestic violence cases involving military families. Victoria felt overwhelmed by the rapid escalation of events, but also experienced a growing sense of hope as professional support systems activated around her. For months, she had felt completely isolated and helpless, but now qualified people were taking her safety seriously and following established procedures to protect her. Richard made several more desperate phone calls to his attorney, his mother, and various business contacts, trying to use his connections to minimize the legal consequences of his assault. Each conversation revealed his growing panic as he realized that domestic violence charges could destroy his reputation and business relationships. Officers, Richard said finally, his voice carrying forced calm, I'm prepared to acknowledge that emotions ran high during a stressful medical appointment. Perhaps some anger management counseling would be appropriate to prevent future misunderstandings. The admission was carefully worded to minimize criminal liability while acknowledging some responsibility for the incident. Richard's expensive legal training was evident in his attempt to negotiate a resolution that avoided serious charges while maintaining plausible deniability about deliberate assault. But Victoria's injuries, witness testimony, and medical documentation had already created an evidentiary foundation that couldn't be dismissed through legal maneuvering or financial influence. The case had moved beyond Richard's ability to control through intimidation and wealth. Marcus stood beside his sister, his military bearing providing silent strength and protection as she faced the most important decision of her married life. The choice between continued abuse and uncertain freedom would determine not only her future, but also the safety and welfare of her unborn daughter. For the first time in years, Victoria began to believe that choosing freedom might actually be possible. Lieutenant Commander James Burke arrived at the medical clinic within the hour, his Navy dress uniform commanding immediate respect and attention from everyone present. At 35 years old with extensive experience handling military family crises, he brought both authority and compassion to the volatile domestic violence situation. Marcus saluted his commanding officer smartly, relief evident on his face as professional military support arrived to help navigate the complex intersection of civilian law enforcement and military protocols. Sir, thank you for responding so quickly. The situation has been escalating since I filed the initial report. At ease, Corpsman Wellington, Burke replied, returning the salute before assessing the scene with trained eyes. Hospital security, medical personnel, and civilian authorities were all present, indicating a serious incident requiring careful coordination between multiple jurisdictions. Richard Hayes stood apart from the group, his expensive suit and aggressive posture marking him as the probable perpetrator in this domestic violence case. Burke had dealt with enough similar situations to recognize the type immediately wealthy civilian who believed money exempted him from legal consequences for abusing family members. Officers, Burke addressed the security team with professional courtesy. I'm here to provide military oversight for Corpsman Wellington's involvement in this incident. Please brief me on the current status of your investigation. The senior security officer outlined the events: pregnant woman assaulted by husband during medical appointment, witnessed by military brother, medical evidence documented, victim expressing safety concerns. A textbook domestic violence case requiring immediate protective measures. Burke turned his attention to Victoria, his expression softening with paternal concern as he noticed her swollen cheek and defensive posture. Military families faced unique challenges with domestic violence, and he had helped countless spouses escape abusive situations. Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Commander Burke, Corpsman Wellington's commanding officer. I understand you have experienced a traumatic incident today. My primary concern is ensuring your safety and connecting you with appropriate resources. Victoria nodded gratefully, feeling comforted by Burke's professional demeanor and obvious commitment to helping her. "Thank you, sir. I don't know what to do. I've never been in a situation like this before." "That's completely understandable," Burke replied gently. "Domestic violence situations are overwhelming for everyone involved. The important thing is that you're safe right now and have people committed to keeping you protected." Richard stepped forward aggressively, apparently believing that military rank would give him more leverage than civilian authorities. "Commander, this entire situation has been blown out of proportion by your subordinates' inappropriate interference in family matters. I run a major defense contracting company with substantial Navy relationships." Burke's expression hardened as he processed Richard's attempt to use business connections as leverage against military personnel performing their duties. Such tactics were not only inappropriate, but potentially constituted attempted coercion of military officials. "Mr. Hayes," Burke said coldly, "are you attempting to influence a military investigation by referencing business relationships with Navy installations? Because if so, that would constitute a federal offense with serious criminal implications." Richard backpedaled quickly, recognizing that his usual intimidation tactics were not only ineffective, but potentially making his legal situation worse. "Of course not. Commander, I'm simply trying to provide context about my professional standing and community reputation." Marcus observed the exchange with professional interest, noting how Burke's arrival had shifted the power dynamics significantly. Richard's wealth and connections meant nothing to a military officer focused on protecting domestic violence victims and ensuring proper legal procedures. "Sir," Marcus addressed his commanding officer formally, "the victim is my sister. I realize that creates potential complications for military protocols, but I followed all proper procedures for documenting and reporting the assault." Burke nodded approvingly. "Corman Wellington, you handled the situation exactly as required by military regulations and your medical training. Family relationships don't exempt you from duty to protect victims and report crimes." Dr. Mitchell approached the group with medical documentation and professional testimony. "Commander, as the treating physician, I can confirm that Mrs. Hayes sustained injuries consistent with deliberate assault. The trauma pattern and circumstances clearly indicate domestic violence." The medical testimony carried significant weight in military proceedings, especially from civilian healthcare providers with no personal stake in the outcome. Burke appreciated having independent professional verification of the assault allegations. Richard's attorney arrived during the medical briefing, a sharp-dressed lawyer who immediately began damage control efforts. "Commander, I represent Mr. Hayes in this matter. We're prepared to cooperate fully with your investigation while protecting my client's constitutional rights." "Counselor," Burke replied evenly, "this is a domestic violence case involving a pregnant victim. Constitutional rights don't include the privilege to assault family members without consequences." Victoria watched the legal maneuvering with growing understanding of how serious the situation had become. Richard's usual strategy of using wealth and connections to avoid accountability was failing against military protocols and professional medical testimony. Carmen Rodriguez arrived unexpectedly, having received Victoria's desperate text message sent during the chaos. Victoria's best friend took one look at the swollen face in official gathering, immediately understanding that her worst fears about Richard's controlling behavior had finally materialized into physical violence. "Victoria, honey, what happened?" Carmen asked, moving protectively toward her friend while shooting accusatory glares at Richard. Years of working as a school counselor had taught her to recognize domestic abuse signs, and she had been worried about Victoria's marriage for months. "Richard hit me during the ultrasound appointment," Victoria said quietly, finding strength in Carmen's supportive presence. "Marcus was working here and witnessed everything. Now everyone is trying to figure out what happens next." Carmen felt rage building as she processed the assault details, but focused on providing emotional support rather than confronting Richard directly. Her professional training emphasized victim safety over satisfying desires for retribution against abusers. "Sweetheart, you know I'm here for whatever you need," Carmen said firmly. "You and the baby are going to be safe, and we'll figure out all the legal stuff together." Burke observed the friend's arrival with professional interest, recognizing that domestic violence victims needed strong support systems to successfully escape abusive relationships. Carmen's protective instincts and obvious loyalty would be valuable assets in helping Victoria navigate the challenges ahead. Richard's attorney began negotiating with the security officers about potential criminal charges, arguing that the incident was a minor domestic dispute that could be resolved through counseling and civil remedies, rather than criminal prosecution. "Counselor," the senior security officer replied, "domestic violence against a pregnant woman is a felony offense regardless of the perpetrator's wealth or social status. We're required to complete our investigation and file appropriate charges." Marcus felt satisfaction watching Richard's legal team struggle against established protocols designed to protect domestic violence victims. Military training had taught him that proper procedures existed specifically to prevent wealthy or influential abusers from escaping consequences through intimidation or corruption. Burke pulled Marcus aside for a private briefing about the military implications of the case. "Corman, I need to understand your level of involvement and any potential conflicts of interest regarding your sister's situation." "Sir, I've followed standard medical protocols for documenting suspected domestic violence," Marcus replied formally. "The family relationship didn't influence my professional assessment or reporting procedures." "Understood," Burke said approvingly. "However, ongoing involvement could create complications for your military service. We need to discuss appropriate boundaries and professional responsibilities." Marcus nodded, understanding that military personnel faced restrictions on civilian legal involvement, even when family members were victims. "Sir, my primary concern is ensuring Victoria's safety. I'm prepared to accept any professional consequences for my actions today." Burke appreciated Marcus's commitment to family protection while maintaining professional integrity. "Corman, your actions today were completely appropriate and professionally handled. The military will support you fully in this matter." Meanwhile, Victoria was having intense discussions with Carmen about immediate safety concerns and long-term options for escaping Richard's control. The conversation revealed the extent of psychological abuse and financial manipulation that had trapped her in the marriage. "He controls all the money, the house, even my car registration," Victoria explained. "I have no credit cards, no bank accounts, no legal access to anything. How can I leave when I have nothing and nowhere to go?" Carmen's professional experience with domestic violence cases had prepared her for exactly these kinds of practical obstacles. "Victoria, there are resources specifically designed to help women in your situation. Legal advocates, financial assistance, safe housing options. You don't have to figure this out alone." The conversation was interrupted by Richard's increasingly desperate attempts to minimize the legal consequences of his assault. His attorney was clearly struggling to develop a defense strategy that could overcome medical evidence and witness testimony from military personnel. Burke addressed the group with military authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, this investigation will proceed according to established protocols for domestic violence cases. Mrs. Hayes' safety is the primary priority, followed by appropriate legal consequences for criminal behavior." Richard's expression showed growing panic as he realized that his usual tools for avoiding accountability were ineffective against military discipline and civilian domestic violence procedures. For the first time in his privileged life, wealth and connections couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. Victoria looked around at the people who had mobilized to protect her, her brother in military uniform, his commanding officer providing institutional support, her best friend offering unconditional loyalty, medical professionals documenting evidence, and security officers following legal protocols. The contrast with Richard's isolated desperation was stark and revealing. His abusive behavior had finally exceeded the boundaries that money and social status could protect, leaving him facing criminal charges without the usual escape routes provided by wealth and privilege. For Victoria, this moment represented the beginning of understanding that escape from abuse was not only possible, but actively supported by people with the authority and resources to make it happen safely. Carmen Rodriguez took charge of Victoria's immediate safety needs with the efficiency that came from years of professional experience helping abuse victims navigate crisis situations. As a school counselor, she had witnessed countless women trapped by controlling partners, and she recognized that this moment represented a crucial opportunity for Victoria to break free from Richard's psychological and financial control. "Victoria, we need to get you somewhere safe while all the legal stuff gets sorted out," Carmen said firmly, keeping her voice calm despite her inner rage at seeing her best friend's bruised face. "You can't go home with him tonight. Not after what happened here." Victoria felt overwhelmed by the rapid changes in her situation. 6 hours ago, she had been excited about learning her baby's gender. Now she was facing the collapse of her marriage, potential criminal charges against her husband, and the terrifying prospect of starting over with nothing but the clothes on her back. "Where can I go?" Victoria whispered, touching her swollen cheek. "Richard controls everything. The house, the bank accounts, even my car registration. I don't have money for a hotel or apartment. I've been completely dependent on him for 6 years." Marcus overheard his sister's conversation while briefing Lieutenant Commander Burke on the domestic violence documentation. "Victoria, you're not alone in this. I have savings, and there are military family support resources available. We'll figure out the practical details." Dr. Mitchell approached with official medical paperwork and professional recommendations. "Mrs. Hayes, I've completed the domestic violence documentation required by state law. I'm also referring you to counseling services that specialize in helping pregnant women who've experienced trauma. The medical report would provide crucial evidence in any criminal prosecution, but more importantly, it created an official record that could support legal protections like restraining orders or emergency custody arrangements." Victoria was beginning to understand that professionals were taking her situation seriously and following established procedures to ensure her safety. Richard paced near the examination room windows, frantically making phone calls to his mother, Eleanor, and various business associates. His conversations revealed growing panic as he realized the assault had created legal problems that couldn't be solved through his usual methods of intimidation and financial leverage. "Mother, you need to contact Harrison immediately." Richard spoke urgently into his phone. "This military, nobody is trying to destroy our family's reputation with false accusations. We need damage control before this gets out to our social circle." Eleanor Hayes's response was clearly audible to everyone nearby, her aristocratic voice dripping with disdain for the common people who were obviously trying to extract money from the family through legal manipulation. Her suggestions involved hiring private investigators to discredit Victoria and Marcus while using political connections to suppress criminal charges. Burke listened to Richard's phone conversations with professional interest, recognizing the typical pattern of wealthy families attempting to use influence and intimidation to avoid accountability for domestic violence. Such tactics often backfired by creating additional criminal charges for obstruction of justice and witness intimidation. "Corman Wellington," Burke addressed Marcus formally, "I need to brief you on potential complications you might face as this case proceeds. Wealthy defendants often attempt to discredit military personnel by filing false complaints or using political pressure to damage careers." Marcus nodded, understanding that protecting Victoria might come at significant personal and professional cost. "Sir, I'm prepared for whatever consequences result from doing the right thing. My sister's safety is more important than my career advancement." Carmen was simultaneously making her own phone calls, contacting the network of domestic violence advocates and support services she had developed through her professional work. Within minutes, she had arranged temporary safe housing and legal consultation for Victoria. "I've got good news," Carmen announced. "There's a safe house specifically for pregnant women escaping domestic violence. They have security, medical support, and legal advocates on staff. You can stay there while we figure out longer-term arrangements." Victoria felt a mixture of relief and terror at the prospect of leaving Richard's control. Years of psychological conditioning had made her believe she was incapable of surviving independently, but the professional support surrounding her was beginning to crack that destructive programming. Richard's attorney finished his negotiations with hospital security and approached the group with a carefully prepared statement. "My client is prepared to enter voluntary anger management counseling and agrees to temporary separation while emotions cool down. We believe this approach will serve everyone's interest better than criminal prosecution." "Counselor," Burke replied coldly, "domestic violence against a pregnant woman is a felony offense. Your client's willingness to attend counseling doesn't negate criminal liability for assault and battery." The legal maneuvering continued as Richard's team tried every possible strategy to minimize consequences, while Victoria's support system focused on ensuring her immediate safety and long-term protection. The contrast between the approaches was stark and revealing. Dr. Mitchell pulled Victoria aside for a private medical consultation. "Mrs. Hayes, I need to address some concerns about your pregnancy. The stress from today's trauma could potentially affect your baby's development. We should schedule follow-up appointments to monitor both your physical and emotional recovery." The reminder about potential harm to her unborn daughter strengthened Victoria's resolve to prioritize safety over Richard's demands. For months, she had endured his abuse by telling herself that maintaining family stability was worth personal sacrifice. Now she understood that protecting her child required escaping the violent environment Richard had created. Marcus received a text message that made his expression shift from concerned to grimly determined. Lieutenant Commander, I'm getting reports that Richard's family is already mobilizing resources to discredit Victoria and me. Private investigators, political pressure, attempts to influence my military chain of command. Burke's jaw tightened as he processed the intelligence about retaliatory activities. Corpsman, that information confirms our assessment about potential escalation. We need to document everything carefully and prepare for a sustained campaign of intimidation and harassment. Carmen noticed Victoria's growing anxiety as the implications of challenging Richard's wealth and power became clearer. Sweetie, I know this is scary, but you're not fighting this battle alone. There are laws specifically designed to protect women in your situation, and you have people with real authority supporting you. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Detective Frank Morris, a 42-year-old investigator with extensive experience in domestic violence cases. His presence indicated that the incident had been escalated to criminal investigation level, moving beyond hospital security into serious legal territory. Ladies and gentlemen, Detective Morris announced, I'm here to conduct interviews and collect evidence for potential criminal charges related to domestic assault. This is now an official police investigation with full legal authority. Richard's confident facade finally cracked completely as he realized that wealth and connections couldn't prevent criminal prosecution when there was medical evidence, witness testimony, and military documentation supporting the victim's account. For the first time in his privileged life, he faced real consequences for his actions. Victoria watched her husband's panic with mixed emotions. Part of her felt satisfied seeing Richard's arrogance replaced by genuine fear, but another part grieved for the marriage she had thought they shared before his true nature was revealed. Detective Morris began individual interviews with all parties involved, starting with Victoria as the primary victim. His professional questioning revealed the extent of Richard's psychological manipulation and control tactics, painting a disturbing picture of a systematic domestic abuse that had escalated to physical violence. Mrs. Hayes, Detective Morris said gently, based on your testimony and the evidence we've collected, we have sufficient grounds for criminal charges. However, I need to explain the realities of prosecuting wealthy defendants who have resources to mount expensive legal defenses. The warning was sobering but not discouraging. Victoria was beginning to understand that justice might be difficult and expensive to achieve, but it was no longer impossible thanks to the professional support system that had activated around her. Marcus completed his formal statement with military precision, providing detailed medical testimony about Victoria's injuries and his professional assessment of the domestic violence incident. His documentation would be crucial for both criminal prosecution and any civil legal proceedings. As the interviews concluded, Victoria faced the most important decision of her adult life, whether to press criminal charges against Richard and permanently separate from his control, or accept his offers of counseling and reconciliation while remaining trapped in an abusive relationship. The choice would determine not only her future, but also the safety and welfare of her unborn daughter, who deserved to grow up in an environment free from violence and fear. For the first time in years, Victoria felt strong enough to choose freedom over security, truth over comfortable lies, and protection over submission. The decision terrified her, but it also filled her with hope for a future she had never dared imagine possible. Detective Frank Morris spent the next 2 hours conducting thorough interviews with every witness to the domestic violence incident, building a comprehensive case file that would be difficult for even Richard's expensive legal team to challenge. His methodical approach to evidence collection reflected years of experience prosecuting wealthy defendants who believed money could purchase immunity from criminal consequences. Victoria provided detailed testimony about the assault, but also revealed disturbing patterns of psychological abuse and financial control that had been escalating throughout her pregnancy. Her statement painted a picture of systematic domestic violence that went far beyond the single slap witnessed by medical personnel. Mrs. Hayes, you've described concerning behaviors that suggest ongoing emotional abuse and financial manipulation, Detective Morris said gently. These patterns often precede physical violence and indicate significant risk for further escalation. Richard's attorney observed the interviews with growing concern, recognizing that Victoria's testimony was creating a narrative of sustained domestic abuse rather than an isolated incident of lost temper. Such patterns were much more difficult to dismiss as temporary emotional outbursts requiring counseling rather than criminal prosecution. Marcus provided his professional medical assessment of Victoria's injuries, complete with photographic documentation and analysis of trauma patterns. His military training in combat medicine lent credibility to his testimony about the deliberate nature of the assault. Detective, based on my experience treating trauma patients, Mrs. Hayes's injuries are completely consistent with deliberate assault by an adult male, Marcus testified formally. The force and placement of the blow indicate intentional violence rather than accidental contact. Dr. Mitchell corroborated Marcus's medical assessment with her own professional expertise, creating multiple layers of medical evidence that would be virtually impossible to refute in criminal proceedings. The combination of civilian and military medical testimony provided overwhelming support for domestic violence charges. Meanwhile, Richard was making increasingly desperate phone calls to his mother, Eleanor, his business partners, and various political contacts, trying to mobilize influence to suppress the criminal investigation. His conversations revealed panic about potential damage to his business reputation and social standing. "Mother, you need to understand the seriousness of this situation," Richard spoke urgently. "If this gets out to our social circle or business associates, it could destroy everything we've built. The military connection makes it even worse because of our defense contracts." Eleanor Hayes's response was swift and ruthless. "Richard, I told you that marrying beneath your class would eventually cause problems. That girl and her common family are obviously trying to extort money from us through false accusations. We need to destroy their credibility immediately." Lieutenant Commander Burke overheard Eleanor's conversation and made careful notes about potential witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. Military personnel were trained to document attempts at interference with criminal investigations, especially when defense contractors were involved. Carmen spent her time researching legal resources and support services for domestic violence victims, building a comprehensive support network for Victoria's transition from financial dependence to independent living. Her professional experience with abuse cases had taught her that successful escape required extensive planning and community support. "Victoria, I've contacted several organizations that specialize in helping pregnant women escape domestic violence," Carmen reported. "They can provide temporary housing, legal advocacy, financial assistance, and counseling services. You won't have to navigate this alone." Victoria felt overwhelmed by the complexity of extricating herself from Richard's control while managing pregnancy complications and potential legal proceedings. 6 years of financial dependence had left her completely unprepared for independent living, especially while dealing with trauma and pregnancy stress. "I don't know how to do any of this," Victoria admitted. "Richard handled all the finances, legal matters, even basic household decisions. I feel like a child trying to manage adult responsibilities." Dr. Mitchell addressed Victoria's stress-related pregnancy concerns with professional medical guidance. "Mrs. Hayes, trauma can affect both your physical and emotional health during pregnancy. We need to monitor you closely for signs of complications like preterm labor or depression." The medical warnings added another layer of urgency to Victoria's situation, as prolonged exposure to Richard's abuse could potentially harm her unborn daughter's development. The stakes were no longer just about Victoria's safety, but also about protecting her child from the devastating effects of domestic violence. Detective Morris completed his evidence collection and prepared to brief the district attorney's office about potential criminal charges. The case was strong enough to prosecute despite Richard's wealth and political connections, but success would require careful preparation for expensive legal defenses. "Mrs. Hayes, based on the evidence we've collected, we have grounds for multiple felony charges including domestic assault, battery of a pregnant woman, and potentially witness intimidation if your husband's family attempts to pressure you into dropping charges," Detective Morris explained. Richard's attorney requested a private conference with the detective, hoping to negotiate a plea agreement that would avoid criminal prosecution in exchange for counseling, financial restitution, and voluntary separation. Such arrangements were common in domestic violence cases involving wealthy defendants. "Detective, my client recognizes that emotions ran high during a stressful medical appointment," the attorney proposed. "He's prepared to enter extensive counseling, provide generous financial support for his wife's needs, and agreed a temporary separation while working on their marriage. Counselor, Detective Morris replied firmly. Domestic violence against a pregnant woman is a serious felony offense that can't be negotiated away through counseling and financial arrangements. Your client's wealth doesn't exempt him from criminal prosecution. The rejection of plea negotiations sent Richard into deeper panic, as he realized that his usual strategies for avoiding accountability were failing against determined law enforcement and strong evidence. For the first time in his life, money and connections couldn't protect him from consequences. Marcus received troubling intelligence through military channels about Richard's family mobilizing resources to discredit both him and Victoria. Private investigators were already digging into their backgrounds, looking for any information that could be weaponized to undermine their credibility. Lieutenant Commander, I'm receiving reports that Eleanor Hayes has hired multiple private investigation firms to build cases against Victoria and me, Marcus reported. They're apparently looking for anything that could be used to claim we're lying or motivated by financial gain. Burke nodded grimly, recognizing the typical pattern of wealthy families attempting to destroy domestic violence victims through character assassination and legal intimidation. Corman, we expected this type of retaliation. Document everything carefully and avoid any actions that could be misinterpreted or used against you. Carmen's professional network had warned her about similar tactics used against abuse victims who challenged wealthy perpetrators. Victoria, we need to prepare for attempts to discredit you through social media attacks, false rumors, and legal harassment. These people have unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. Victoria felt increasingly overwhelmed by the scope of Richard's retaliation efforts, but also strengthened by understanding that such extreme measures proved how threatened he felt by her decision to seek protection. His desperate tactics revealed weakness rather than strength. Dr. Mitchell received a concerning phone call from hospital administration about complaints regarding her handling of the domestic violence case. The pressure was clearly coming from Richard's family and their political connections, attempting to undermine medical testimony through professional intimidation. Dr. Mitchell, we've received several complaints about your involvement in this domestic dispute, the administrator said carefully. Perhaps it would be appropriate to transfer Mrs. Hayes' care to another physician to avoid any appearance of bias. Administrator, I followed all required protocols for domestic violence reporting, Dr. Mitchell replied firmly. My medical testimony is based on objective evidence and professional expertise. I won't be intimidated into abandoning a patient who needs medical protection. The attempted medical interference backfired by creating additional evidence of witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. Detective Morris added these incidents to his growing case file, documenting the Hayes family's attempts to suppress criminal prosecution through pressure and influence. Victoria's stress levels began affecting her pregnancy, causing concerning symptoms that required immediate medical attention. The irony was devastating. Richard's abuse was potentially harming the daughter he claimed to want so desperately to control. Mrs. Hayes, I'm detecting early signs of pregnancy complications that could be stress-related, Dr. Mitchell explained during an emergency examination. We need to get you into a safe and stable environment immediately to protect both your health and your baby's development. The medical emergency added urgency to all the legal and logistical preparations for Victoria's escape from Richard's control. Her physical safety and her unborn daughter's health now depended on successfully breaking free from the abusive marriage despite Richard's wealth and resources. Marcus coordinated with Lieutenant Commander Burke to ensure military support for Victoria's protection while she transitioned to independent living. The Navy's family support services included resources specifically designed to help domestic violence victims escape dangerous situations. Carmen finalized arrangements for Victoria's immediate relocation to a secure facility designed for pregnant women fleeing domestic violence. The safe house provided not only physical protection, but also legal advocacy, medical care, and counseling services necessary for successful recovery from trauma. As evening approached, Victoria faced the moment of truth, leaving the hospital with Carmen to begin a new life free from Richard's control, or returning home and accepting whatever escalated abuse might result from the day's challenges to his authority. The choice would determine whether her daughter grew up in an environment of violence and fear, or in a safe space where women were treated with dignity and respect. For Victoria, that decision made itself. Victoria's stress-induced pregnancy complications required immediate hospitalization, transforming the domestic violence case into a medical emergency that demanded urgent intervention. Dr. Mitchell admitted her patient with symptoms of preterm labor caused by trauma and elevated cortisol levels, potentially endangering both mother and baby. Mrs. Hayes, your body is responding to extreme stress in ways that could trigger early delivery, Dr. Mitchell explained as nurses connected monitoring equipment. We need to stabilize your condition and eliminate the stressors that are threatening your pregnancy. Marcus used his medical credentials to gain access to Victoria's hospital room, his Navy uniform commanding respect from staff members who recognized his authority as a trained hospital corpsman. His presence provided emotional support for Victoria, while also ensuring professional medical oversight of her care. Victoria, the baby's heartbeat is strong, but your blood pressure and stress hormones are dangerously elevated, Marcus reported after reviewing her medical charts. The doctors are concerned about potential complications if you're exposed to continued trauma. Richard arrived at the hospital with Eleanor Hayes and a small army of expensive attorneys, attempting to gain control over Victoria's medical care and legal decisions. His strategy involved claiming spousal rights to make medical decisions while portraying Victoria as mentally unstable due to pregnancy hormones and stress. Doctors, my wife is obviously suffering from severe pregnancy-related anxiety and paranoid thinking, Richard declared to the medical staff. I need to ensure she receives appropriate psychiatric evaluation and treatment for her delusional accusations against me. Dr. Mitchell stood firm against Richard's intimidation tactics, invoking hospital policies designed to protect domestic violence victims from further abuse. Mr. Hayes, your wife is under medical protection orders that limit your access to her care. Hospital security will escort you from the premises if you attempt to interfere with her treatment. Eleanor Hayes deployed her considerable social influence to pressure hospital administration into overruling the medical staff's protective measures. Her phone calls to board members and major donors created significant pressure to accommodate the Hayes family's demands for access and control. Dr. Mitchell, we've received numerous calls from concerned community leaders about Mrs. Hayes' medical care, the hospital administrator said carefully. Perhaps we should consider transferring her to a private facility where she can receive more personalized attention. Lieutenant Commander Burke arrived in full dress uniform, his military authority providing institutional support for Marcus's position and intimidating Richard's legal team. The Navy's involvement elevated the case from simple domestic violence to potential federal crimes involving military families. Hospital administration, I'm here to ensure proper protocols are followed for protecting domestic violence victims who are pregnant, Burke announced formally. The military has jurisdiction when active duty personnel are involved in protecting family members from abuse. Carmen organized Victoria's teacher friends to provide character witnesses and emotional support, creating a visible network of professional women who vouched for Victoria's mental stability and credibility. Their presence countered Richard's narrative about Victoria being unstable and unreliable. We've known Victoria for years as a dedicated teacher and caring person, testified Sarah Chen, Victoria's former teaching partner. Her commitment to helping children and her professional competence are beyond question. These accusations of mental instability are completely inconsistent with her character. Marcus conducted his own investigation into Victoria's medical treatment, discovering concerning evidence that Richard had been secretly medicating her with mild sedatives disguised as prenatal vitamins. The discovery explained Victoria's frequent fatigue and cognitive difficulties throughout her pregnancy. Detective Morris, I found evidence that Victoria has been unknowingly ingesting sedatives for months, Marcus reported grimly. Blood tests confirmed the presence of benzodiazepines that weren't prescribed by her doctor. This constitutes drugging without consent and endangering a pregnant woman. The drugging revelation transformed the case from simple domestic assault to sophisticated psychological manipulation and potentially attempted harm to an unborn child. Richard's careful program of medication explained Victoria's increasing passivity and compliance throughout her pregnancy. Dr. Mitchell ordered comprehensive toxicology testing to determine the full extent of Victoria's involuntary medication and assess potential harm to fetal development. The medical evidence would provide additional criminal charges against Richard while explaining Victoria's difficulty recognizing and resisting his abuse. Mrs. Hayes, the sedatives in your system explain many of the symptoms you've been experiencing, Dr. Mitchell explained gently. Cognitive fog, fatigue, memory problems, and difficulty making decisions are all consistent with chronic benzodiazepine exposure during pregnancy. Victoria felt a mixture of rage and relief as she understood how Richard had been manipulating her mental state to maintain control. The drugging explained why she had felt increasingly helpless and confused during her pregnancy, unable to trust her own perceptions about his escalating abuse. Richard's attorneys scrambled to develop defenses against the new charges. But drugging a pregnant woman without consent represented serious federal crimes that couldn't be dismissed through plea negotiations or financial settlements. The evidence was objective and medically documented. Eleanor Hayes escalated her pressure campaign by threatening to withdraw substantial donations from the hospital's building fund and orchestrating social ostracism against medical staff who supported Victoria's protection. Her tactics revealed the family's desperation and willingness to abuse their wealth and influence. Dr. Mitchell, Mrs. Hayes has made it clear that continued interference in family matters will result in significant financial consequences for this hospital, the administrator warned. Perhaps you should reconsider your involvement in this case. Burke documented Eleanor's intimidation attempts as evidence of witness tampering and obstruction of justice, adding federal charges to the growing criminal case against the Hayes family. Military personnel were trained to recognize and document attempts to interfere with domestic violence investigations. Administrator, Burke said firmly, threats against medical personnel protecting domestic violence victims constitute federal crimes. I'm documenting Mrs. Eleanor Hayes' attempts to obstruct justice and intimidate witnesses in an ongoing criminal investigation. Carmen worked with domestic violence advocates to arrange an independent psychiatric evaluation for Victoria, ensuring that any mental health assessment would be conducted by professionals with no financial ties to the Hayes family. The evaluation would counter Richard's claims about Victoria's alleged instability. Victoria, we've arranged for Dr. Patricia Wells, a forensic psychiatrist who specializes in domestic violence cases, Carmen explained. She'll evaluate your mental state objectively and provide testimony about the psychological effects of sustained abuse. The independent psychiatric evaluation took place over several hours, with Dr. Wells conducting comprehensive interviews and psychological testing to assess Victoria's mental competency and document the trauma effects of prolonged domestic abuse and involuntary medication. Mrs. Hayes, my evaluation confirms that you are mentally competent and psychologically stable. Dr. Wells reported, your cognitive difficulties were clearly caused by involuntary sedation rather than any underlying mental health disorder. The psychological conditioning from sustained abuse explains your difficulty recognizing and reporting the mistreatment. The psychiatric testimony provided definitive refutation of Richard's claims about Victoria's mental instability, while documenting the sophisticated psychological manipulation tactics he had used to maintain control over her decision-making abilities. Detective Morris arrested Richard on multiple felony charges, including domestic assault, battery of a pregnant woman, drugging without consent, and endangering fetal development. The arrest took place at his office, creating maximum professional embarrassment and public exposure. Richard Hayes, you are under arrest for domestic violence, involuntary drugging, and endangering the welfare of an unborn child, Detective Morris announced formally. You have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. The arrest generated immediate media attention due to Richard's prominence in the business community and his family's social standing. Local news outlets covered the story extensively, making it impossible for the Hayes family to suppress public knowledge of the domestic violence charges. Eleanor Hayes hired additional private investigators to conduct opposition research on Victoria, Marcus, Carmen, and even the medical staff involved in the case. Her scorched earth approach revealed the family's willingness to destroy anyone who challenged their control. Detective, we're receiving reports that Mrs. Eleanor Hayes has hired multiple investigation firms to harass witnesses and gather compromising information about everyone involved in this case. Marcus reported through military channels. Burke coordinated with federal authorities to investigate Eleanor's witness intimidation campaign, which had expanded beyond simple domestic violence into organized obstruction of justice involving multiple victims and witnesses. Victoria's hospitalization continued for 3 days, while doctors worked to eliminate the sedatives from her system and stabilize her pregnancy. The medical care included counseling to help her process the trauma of discovering she had been drugged for months without her knowledge. Mrs. Hayes, The detoxification process will take several more days, but your cognitive function should return to normal as the sedatives clear your system, Dr. Mitchell explained. The psychological effects of realizing you've been secretly medicated will require ongoing counseling support. Carmen maintained constant vigil at Victoria's bedside, providing emotional support and coordinating with legal advocates to prepare for the complex criminal and civil proceedings that would determine Victoria's future safety and financial security. Victoria, I want you to know that everyone involved in your care is committed to seeing this through to the end, Carmen assured her friend. Richard and his mother can't buy their way out of criminal charges when there's this much evidence and professional testimony. Marcus balanced his hospital visits with his military duties, but Lieutenant Commander Burke ensured that protecting Victoria remained a priority supported by Navy Family Services. The military's involvement provided institutional weight that Richard's money and influence couldn't counteract. Corpsman Wellington, your actions in protecting your sister and documenting this domestic violence case reflect credit on the Navy and demonstrate the values we expect from our medical personnel. Burke commended formally. The criminal case against Richard proceeded rapidly due to the overwhelming evidence and professional testimony from medical and military personnel. His expensive legal team struggled to develop effective defenses against objective medical documentation and credible witness testimony. Richard's business partnerships began dissolving as news of the domestic violence charges spread through the professional community. Defense contractors and real estate investors distanced themselves from someone facing serious felony charges for abusing a pregnant woman. Mr. Hayes, several major partners are requesting immediate contract reviews in light of the criminal charges, Richard's business manager reported nervously. The negative publicity is affecting our ability to secure new projects and maintain existing relationships. Eleanor Hayes faced her own legal troubles as federal investigators documented her witness intimidation campaign and attempts to obstruct justice. Her social prominence provided no protection against charges related to interfering with domestic violence investigations. Victoria's recovery progressed steadily as the involuntary sedatives cleared her system and her natural cognitive abilities returned. The improvement in her mental clarity made the extent of Richard's manipulation and control even more shocking and enraging. I can't believe how foggy and confused I felt for months, Victoria confided to Carmen. Now I understand why I couldn't think clearly enough to recognize what was happening or ask for help. Richard was literally drugging me into compliance. Dr. Mitchell documented Victoria's recovery as additional evidence of the harm caused by Richard's secret medication program. The medical testimony would be crucial for both criminal prosecution and civil proceedings to recover damages for the abuse. The hospital's board of directors ultimately supported Dr. Mitchell's actions and rejected Eleanor Hayes' financial pressure to withdraw medical testimony. Professional ethics and legal obligations outweighed concerns about donor relations. Dr. Mitchell, while we regret the Hayes family's decision to withdraw their financial support, we fully support your professional handling of this domestic violence case, the board chairman announced publicly. As Victoria's hospitalization concluded and her transfer to the safe house approached, she faced the reality of starting completely over with no financial resources, no home, and no possessions except the support of people who truly cared about her welfare. But for the first time in years, Victoria felt mentally clear, emotionally strong, and genuinely hopeful about her future and her daughter's safety. The truth about Richard's abuse and manipulation was finally exposed, and justice seemed not only possible but probable. The battle for her freedom was far from over, but Victoria no longer faced it alone or defenseless. The criminal trial of Richard Hayes began 3 months after Victoria's hospitalization, generating intense media coverage due to the defendant's prominent social standing and the shocking evidence of systematic domestic abuse, including involuntary drugging of a pregnant woman. The prosecution's case was bolstered by overwhelming medical evidence, incredible testimony from military and civilian professionals. District Attorney Margaret Collins personally prosecuted the case, recognizing that successful conviction of a wealthy domestic abuser would send a powerful message about equal justice, regardless of social class or financial resources. Her opening statement outlined the systematic pattern of abuse that had escalated from psychological manipulation to physical violence and chemical control. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence will show that Richard Hayes engaged in a calculated campaign of abuse against his pregnant wife. including secret drugging designed to impair her mental capacity and maintain psychological control, Collins declared. This case represents domestic violence in its most sophisticated and dangerous form. Richard's defense team, led by prominent criminal attorney Harrison Webb, attempted to portray the entire case as a conspiracy by Victoria and Marcus to extract money from a wealthy family through false accusations and medical manipulation. Their strategy involved character assassination and claims of financial motivation. Defense will prove that Mrs. Hayes and her military brother concocted this elaborate scheme to destroy Mr. Hayes's reputation and gain access to his considerable wealth through fraudulent domestic violence claims. Webb argued, the alleged evidence has been manufactured and misrepresented by people with obvious financial incentives to lie. Victoria testified for 2 days, describing the gradual escalation of Richard's controlling behavior from subtle manipulation during their early marriage to the physical assault and involuntary drugging that had endangered both her and her unborn daughter. Her testimony was detailed, consistent, and emotionally compelling. Richard controlled every aspect of my life, from what I wore to who I could speak with, Victoria testified clearly. When I became pregnant, his control became more extreme. I felt increasingly confused and helpless, but now I understand that was because he was secretly drugging me. Marcus provided professional medical testimony about Victoria's injuries and the effects of prolonged involuntary sedation during pregnancy. His military credentials and objective documentation proved difficult for the defense to challenge effectively. Based on my training as a Navy hospital corpsman and my analysis of Mrs. Hayes's blood tests, she was systematically given benzodiazepines without her knowledge for approximately 4 months, Marcus testified. This level of medication would have significantly impaired her cognitive function and decision-making abilities. Dr. Mitchell's medical testimony corroborated Marcus's assessment while providing additional evidence about the assault injuries and their consistency with deliberate domestic violence. Her professional reputation and detailed documentation proved crucial for the prosecution's case. Mrs. Hayes's facial injuries were completely consistent with an open-hand strike delivered with significant force, Dr. Mitchell testified. The pattern and severity of the trauma could not have resulted from accidental contact with furniture or other objects. Lieutenant Commander Burke provided testimony about military protocols for domestic violence reporting and the professionalism demonstrated by Marcus throughout the investigation. His institutional authority countered defense attempts to portray Marcus as biased or financially motivated. Corpsman Wellington followed all appropriate military procedures for documenting and reporting domestic violence, Burke testified. His actions were professionally exemplary and consistent with our training for protecting family members from abuse. Carmen testified about Victoria's psychological state before and after escaping Richard's control, providing evidence of the dramatic improvement in her friend's cognitive function and emotional stability once the involuntary medication ended. Victoria was a confident, competent teacher before her marriage, Carmen testified. During her pregnancy, she became increasingly withdrawn and confused. After discovering the drugging, she returned to her natural intelligence and strength. The prosecution presented extensive evidence, including medical records, photographs of injuries, toxicology reports confirming involuntary drugging, witness testimony, and recordings of Richard's threatening statements. The cumulative effect was overwhelming and difficult to refute. Richard's defense attempted to discredit the medical evidence by claiming the sedatives were prescribed anxiety medication that Victoria had forgotten taking due to pregnancy-related memory problems. This explanation collapsed under cross-examination when medical records showed no such prescriptions. Mr. Hayes, can you produce any medical records showing that benzodiazepines were prescribed for your wife's anxiety during pregnancy? Prosecutor Collins asked pointedly. She might have gotten them from a different doctor, Richard stammered, his confident facade cracking under pressure. Pregnant women often forget things due to hormonal changes. The defense also attempted to portray the assault as defensive action when Victoria became hysterical during the ultrasound appointment. This strategy backfired when multiple witnesses testified about Richard's unprovoked anger regarding the baby's gender. Eleanor Hayes testified as a character witness for her son, but her arrogant demeanor and obvious disdain for Victoria undermined her credibility with the jury. Her testimony revealed the family's sense of entitlement and belief that wealth exempted them from normal legal consequences. Richard was raised to maintain proper family standards and discipline, Eleanor testified haughtily. Sometimes wives need guidance about appropriate behavior, especially those from lower social backgrounds who don't understand proper deportment. The prosecution's cross-examination of Eleanor revealed her involvement in the witness intimidation campaign and her attempts to suppress the domestic violence investigation through financial pressure and political influence. Mrs. Hayes, did you hire private investigators to gather damaging information about your daughter-in-law and her brother? Collins asked directly. I protected my family's interests using all legal resources available, Eleanor replied defensively. That's what any responsible mother would do when faced with obvious financial extortion. Detective Morris testified about the comprehensive criminal investigation and the attempts by the Hayes family to obstruct justice through intimidation and influence peddling. His professional testimony provided crucial context about the systematic nature of their efforts to avoid accountability. The Hayes family deployed significant resources to discredit witnesses, pressure medical professionals, and interfere with our investigation, Morris testified. Such tactics are consistent with sophisticated attempts to obstruct justice in domestic violence cases involving wealthy defendants. The forensic psychiatrist Dr. Patricia Wells provided definitive testimony about Victoria's mental competency and the psychological effects of sustained domestic abuse combined with involuntary medication. Her evaluation destroyed Richard's claims about Victoria's alleged instability. Mrs. Hayes demonstrated complete mental competency during my evaluation, Dr. Wells testified. Her previous cognitive difficulties were entirely consistent with involuntary benzodiazepine exposure. The psychological conditioning from sustained abuse explains her difficulty recognizing and reporting the mistreatment. Richard's testimony in his own defense proved disastrous, revealing his arrogance, sense of entitlement, and complete lack of remorse for his actions. His attitude toward Victoria and their unborn daughter shocked jurors and undermined any sympathy for his position. I provided Victoria with a lifestyle far beyond her natural social class, Richard declared from the witness stand. In return, I expected appropriate gratitude and compliance with family standards. Her accusations represent betrayal of everything I've given her. The prosecution's closing argument emphasized the overwhelming evidence of systematic domestic abuse and the defendant's complete lack of remorse or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Collins urged the jury to hold Richard accountable regardless of his wealth and social status. Richard Hayes used his money and power to control, abuse, and endanger his pregnant wife. Collins concluded, justice demands that we protect victims of domestic violence from wealthy abusers who believe money exempts them from the consequences of their crimes. The defense's closing argument attempted one final appeal based on Richard's social standing and charitable contributions. While portraying Victoria as an ungrateful gold digger who had destroyed a successful man's life through false accusations, Richard Hayes is a pillar of our community who made the mistake of marrying someone who ultimately sought to destroy him for financial gain, Webb argued desperately. Don't let this successful businessman become the victim of an elaborate extortion scheme. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: domestic assault, battery of a pregnant woman, involuntary drugging, and endangering fetal welfare. The swift decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the defendant's complete failure to generate sympathy or reasonable doubt. Richard's sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, with prosecutors seeking maximum penalties to reflect the serious nature of his crimes and his complete lack of remorse. The convictions would also trigger automatic protective orders and custody restrictions designed to ensure Victoria and her daughter's ongoing safety. Victoria watched the guilty verdicts with mixed emotions: relief that justice had been served, sadness that her marriage had ended in criminal conviction, but overwhelming gratitude that her daughter would grow up protected from Richard's violence and control. The trial's conclusion marked the end of Richard's ability to terrorize Victoria through wealth and intimidation, but the beginning of her new life as a domestic violence survivor with the strength and resources to help other women escape similar situations. Justice had prevailed despite Richard's money and influence, proving that some principles remain more powerful than wealth when supported by courageous people willing to stand up for what was right. 6 months after Richard Hayes' conviction and sentencing to 8 years in federal prison, Victoria gave birth to Hannah Elizabeth Hayes in the same hospital where her ordeal had begun. The healthy 7-pound baby girl arrived surrounded by love from Marcus, Carmen, Dr. Mitchell, and Lieutenant Commander Burke, who had all become her chosen family during the legal battle. "She's absolutely perfect," Victoria whispered, holding her daughter for the first time without fear that Richard would try to control or manipulate their relationship. "Hannah, you're going to grow up knowing you're safe and loved unconditionally." Marcus stood beside his sister's hospital bed in his Navy dress uniform, having received orders for a stateside assignment that would keep him close enough to provide ongoing protection and support. His commanding officer had specifically arranged the transfer to ensure Victoria's family security during her recovery and adjustment to independent living. "Victoria, Lieutenant Commander Burke worked with Navy Family Services to set up my new assignment," Marcus explained proudly. "I'll be stationed at the medical center here permanently, so Hannah will have her uncle nearby while she grows up." Carmen had used her professional connections to help Victoria secure employment as an educational consultant for the district attorney's office, developing programs to help children who witness domestic violence. The position provided meaningful work, good benefits, and flexible scheduling that accommodated her role as a new mother. "Victoria, your experience surviving Richard's abuse and your background in education make you uniquely qualified to help other families," Carmen explained. "The DA's office specifically created this position because they were so impressed with your strength during the trial." Dr. Mitchell continued as Victoria's primary physician, providing ongoing medical care and serving as an expert witness in other domestic violence cases involving pregnant women. Her professional reputation had been enhanced rather than damaged by her courageous stand against the Hayes family's intimidation campaign. "Mrs. Hayes, your recovery from the trauma and involuntary medication has been remarkable," Dr. Mitchell said during a postpartum checkup. "Your experience is helping other doctors recognize the signs of covert drugging in domestic violence cases." Eleanor Hayes faced her own legal consequences, ultimately pleading guilty to witness intimidation and obstruction of justice charges. Her conviction resulted in probation, community service, and substantial financial penalties, while her social standing never recovered from the public exposure of her role in covering up her son's crimes. The Hayes family's real estate empire collapsed as business partners distanced themselves from the domestic violence scandal. Government contracts were terminated, and civil lawsuits from other abuse victims drained the remaining assets, effectively ending 4 generations of accumulated wealth and influence. Detective Morris continued investigating other complaints against Richard that surfaced during the media coverage of his trial. 3 additional women came forward with similar stories of psychological manipulation, financial control, and physical abuse, leading to additional criminal charges that extended his prison sentence. "Mrs. Hayes, your courage in prosecuting Richard has encouraged other victims to come forward," Detective Morris reported. "We now have evidence of a pattern of abuse spanning more than a decade, which will ensure he remains in prison for many years." Victoria used her portion of the civil settlement to establish the Hannah Foundation, providing resources for pregnant women escaping domestic violence. The organization offered safe housing, legal advocacy, medical care, and educational support for mothers trying to build independent lives free from abuse. "I want Hannah to grow up knowing that her birth was the beginning of hope for countless other women," Victoria explained to the Foundation's board of directors. "Every woman deserves the chance to raise her children in safety and dignity." Marcus's military career flourished as he gained recognition for his professional handling of the domestic violence case. His documentation and testimony became training materials for other military medical personnel, and he was promoted ahead of schedule based on his exemplary service. "Corman Wellington, your actions in protecting your sister while maintaining professional integrity reflect the highest standards of Navy medicine," Lieutenant Commander Burke commended during Marcus's promotion ceremony. "You've demonstrated that military personnel can successfully balance family loyalty with professional duty." Carmen was offered a promotion to district supervisor based on her expertise in domestic violence intervention and her role in coordinating Victoria's support network. Her professional experience with abuse cases had expanded significantly through her involvement in the Hayes prosecution. Dr. Mitchell received professional recognition from medical associations for her courageous stance against powerful individuals who attempted to intimidate her into abandoning a domestic violence victim. Her case became a teaching example in medical ethics courses about protecting vulnerable patients. Victoria's relationship with her daughter developed without the fear and manipulation that had characterized her marriage to Richard. Hannah's early months were filled with love, security, and the knowledge that her mother had fought successfully to protect them both from violence. Hannah, your daddy made some very bad choices that hurt Mommy, but you have so many people who love you and will always keep you safe, Victoria explained to her infant daughter. Uncle Marcus, Aunt Carmen, Dr. Mitchell, and Mommy will make sure you grow up strong and happy. 1 year after Richard's conviction, Victoria returned to the medical clinic where her ordeal had begun, this time to support another pregnant woman who had been assaulted by her husband. The victim had specifically requested Victoria's help after learning about her successful prosecution. Mrs. Patterson, I know everything seems impossible right now, but you have more strength than you realize, Victoria counseled gently. The people here will help you just like they helped me. You and your baby can have a safe, happy future. Marcus observed the counseling session with pride in his sister's transformation from victim to advocate. The confident, compassionate woman supporting Mrs. Patterson bore little resemblance to the frightened, confused person he had found in the examination room 2 years earlier. The medical clinic dedicated a patient advocacy office in Victoria's honor, recognizing her courage in exposing domestic violence and her ongoing work to help other victims. The office provided resources and support for women facing similar situations. Victoria, your bravery in standing up to Richard Hayes has changed how we handle domestic violence cases, the clinic administrator announced during the dedication ceremony. Your legacy will protect countless women and children for generations to come. As Victoria stood in the same examination room where Richard had slapped her, now holding healthy Hannah while supporting another abuse victim, the circular nature of her journey was complete. She had transformed from victim to survivor to advocate, using her painful experience to protect other women from similar trauma. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if Marcus hadn't been working here that day, Victoria reflected to Carmen. One random moment changed everything and gave me the chance to save not just myself and Hannah, but other families too. Marcus, now a senior hospital corpsman with specialized training in domestic violence intervention, continued his military service while maintaining his civilian advocacy work. His dual roles allowed him to protect both military families and civilian domestic violence victims. Hannah's first birthday celebration brought together all the people who had fought to protect her before she was even born. The party was held at the foundation offices, surrounded by photos of other mothers and children who had found safety through Victoria's advocacy work. Hannah, look at all the people who love you and work to make sure you could grow up safe and happy, Victoria said, holding her daughter while surrounded by their chosen family. You're going to do amazing things in this world because you were born from love, not fear. The story that had begun with a slap in a medical office had evolved into a legacy of protection, justice, and hope. Victoria's courage in facing Richard's wealth and power had not only saved her own life and her daughter's future, but had also created resources and inspiration for countless other women trapped in similar situations. Richard Hayes remained in federal prison, his appeals having been rejected and his parole eligibility still years away. His former empire lay in ruins, his social standing destroyed, and his attempts to control Victoria's life permanently ended by the legal consequences of his own violent actions. Eleanor Hayes lived in relative obscurity, her social circle having abandoned her after the truth about her family's systematic abuse and cover-up efforts became public knowledge. Her attempts to rebuild her reputation were consistently undermined by her documented role in witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. Victoria's new life was built on foundations of truth, mutual respect, and genuine support rather than the control, manipulation, and fear that had characterized her marriage to Richard. Every day brought new opportunities to help other women while raising Hannah in an environment of safety and love. As Hannah took her first steps in the Foundation's playroom, surrounded by toys donated by other domestic violence survivors who had successfully rebuilt their lives, Victoria felt profound gratitude for the people who had made this moment possible. Marcus, do you remember what you promised me when we were kids? Victoria asked her brother as they watched Hannah play. That I would always protect you, Marcus replied, smiling as his niece toddled toward him with outstretched arms. You kept that promise, Victoria said softly. And now we get to help other families make the same promises to each other. The slap that had echoed through a medical office like a gunshot had ultimately become the sound of breaking chains, freeing not only Victoria and Hannah, but also dozens of other women who found courage in their story of survival, justice, and hope. Their battle was won, but their mission to protect others would continue for as long as women needed safe places to heal, legal advocates to fight for them, and living proof that escape from domestic violence was not only possible, but could lead to lives filled with purpose, love, and genuine security. Hannah's laughter filled the foundation offices as she played with blocks that spelled out words like hope, love, and safe. She would grow up knowing that her mother had fought for those concepts and won, creating a legacy that would protect countless other children from the violence she had never had to experience. The millionaire who had slapped his pregnant wife in front of her Navy corpsman brother had lost everything that mattered to him, while the woman he had tried to control had gained everything that truly counted: freedom, safety, purpose, and the knowledge that love was stronger than fear when supported by people willing to stand up for what was right. If this story grips you the way it gripped me, hit that like button right now. It helps more people discover these important stories. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because we dive deep into cases that matter, stories that need to be told. Drop a comment and let me know what you think about Victoria's incredible journey from victim to survivor to advocate. And if this story moves you, share it, because sometimes one shared story can save a life. Now, let me tell you exactly how this all began.